Welcome to Bobby Owsinski's Inner Circle. I'm Bobby Owsinski, and this is a show all about music production, and the music business. My guest today is influential Nashville engineer Ed Seay. First of all, Nielsen Music's latest report says vinyl is up 19% this year over the same time last year. So for the first 6 months of the year, vinyl is up by a lot. A couple months ago, I mentioned about how I thought vinyl was plateauing. It doesn't seem to be, although the numbers are still sort of small in the grand scheme of things. For instance, even though it's up 19%, that only means 7.6 million sales. Now, that is 11.2% of all album sales and 19% of all physical album sales, but it's really not that much, again, in the grand scheme of things when all is said and done. One of the interesting parts of this report was that CDs sold about 40.6 million in the first 6 months of the year. Why is that important? Well, last year, there was about 87 million sold. If things keep on going the way they are, that means that CD sales will be down, but they won't be down all that much. So for everyone that seems to be thinking that CD sales are going to fall off a cliff, that doesn't seem to be happening. Yes, they're decreasing every year, but not by as much as was predicted. So if we look at the top 10 vinyl albums of the year so far, what we find is Jack White, once again, leads everybody. And this seems to happen. Every year he releases a new vinyl album, and every year it hits the number one spot on the vinyl record list. So this one is Boarding House Ranch, but that only means 37,000 sold. Kendrick Lamar came in at number 2 with Damn, 30,000 sold. The soundtrack for Guardians of the Galaxy came in at 28,000. That was number 3. Michael Jackson's Thriller at 28,000, number 4. Fleetwood Mac's Rumors at 28,000, number 5. Panic at the Disco, Pray for the Wicked, 26,000 at number 6. Justin Timberlake's Man of the Woods, again, 26,000 or so at number 7. Prince of the Revolution, Purple Rain, the soundtrack, 25,000 for number 8. Amy Winehouse, Back to Black, 25,000 number 9. And the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, 23,000 comes in last at number 10. When you look at this, what's interesting is the fact that there are still way too many old records that are appearing in the top 10. So for vinyl to have any real legs in the future, it's going to have to be more contemporary artists. And right now we're seeing some, but we're not seeing enough. So even though vinyl seems to be doing pretty well, it's not really going to make the music industry a huge amount of money, but it does make for a nice story. If you have any questions or comments, you can send them to questions@BobbyOInnerCircle.com. Check out my Hitmakers Club for access to the Private Mixers Facebook group, monthly deconstructed hits, mixing workshop, and Q&A webinars, and for a short time, access to my core training module bonus. Go to hitmakersclub.com to learn more. Now, recently I posted something about the Fender Jazzmaster on my blog. And what I posted about was the fact that it had just celebrated its 60th anniversary. Yeah, the Jazzmaster's been around for 60 years. But what I think is really compelling about this is the fact that it's really become the new Strat. When you look at all of the newer bands that are out there playing, instead of having Strats, all the guitar players have Jazzmasters. And this is kind of cool. I always felt that the Jazzmaster is very, very unique. But it never really caught on the way it was supposed to, until now, that is. So a little bit of history. The Jazzmaster came out in 1958, and it was at the time the top of the Fender line. It sold for $329, which is about $50 more than the Strat. Now, it was definitely intended to go after jazz musicians, and especially after the jazz musicians that were using Gibson guitars. Gibson had owned that market at the time, and Leo Fender was trying to go after some of that market. So he thought he would design a guitar that would appeal to the jazz player. And what he did was he made a guitar that in fact had a very mellow sound. This comes from the flat pickups, and the coils were very, very wide underneath the top of the pickup cover, and the magnets were actually underneath. So that really took away a lot of the attack of the sound, and it gave it what he thought was a better jazz sound. The other thing was that the offset body was made specifically for a player that was sitting rather than standing. So again, most jazz players of the time sat. It was also the first Fender guitar with the rosewood fretboard, and it had a new floating tremolo, which never really caught on, but it was unique for the time. It also had a rhythm circuit, so you could switch between a lead and a rhythm circuit. Again, totally unique, but not something that ever really caught on. So jazz players kind of shunned it, and for a while, Fender actually thought it was a bleak failure. In the 60s, though, surf bands, especially in California, really took a liking to the Jazzmaster, and this is brought about by the Ventures. Bob Bogle, who was the lead guitar player at the time and eventually became the bass player of the Ventures, he played a Jazzmaster on their really big hit and influential hit, Walk Don't Run. And if you were a guitar player coming up in the 60s and 70s and maybe even a little bit later, that was one of the first songs that you learned how to play. A little bit later into the 80s and even into the 90s, punk bands began to really dig having a Jazzmaster in the band, and we saw that with Television, the band Television, and with Sonic Youth, and many, many more. The problem was it still wasn't selling, so Fender actually discontinued it in 1980, but reintroduced it in 1984, but it never really took off until 1994. In 1994, the Jazzmaster got a whole new life, and now, today, it's bigger than ever, and in fact, in some ways, it's more influential for today's players than a Strat, for sure. One interesting thing, and probably the last thing I'll say about this, is the fact that you can still buy a vintage Jazzmaster for not a lot of money. For instance, a 1958 Jazzmaster goes for about $4,000. That's it. A 1975 one goes for about $1,500. Now compare that to any other vintage guitar of that era, and you'll find that that's kind of like peanuts. And it's really not that far away from what a brand new instrument costs these days. Jazzmasters now come in a lot of different forms. There's a lot of different models. There's something for everybody. But I personally still like the classic versions. But I think it's also one of those things that's generational. And now that we have this generation really digging that instrument, let's see how long it carries on. But right now, Fender is enjoying the fact that the Jazzmaster has had a resurgence again. Nashville engineer Ed Seay has worked with hitmakers like Blake Shelton, Lee Brice, Martina McBride, Ricky Skaggs, Dolly Parton, Pam Tillis, Highway 101, Colin Ray, and many others, and he was one of the first high-profile engineers to champion in-the-box recording and mixing. His most recent project was totally unique, however, as he was called to re-record and mix the re-release of a well-loved Elvis Presley gospel album. On the podcast today, Ed described what he went through to both preserve Elvis's original performances while trying to update the sound with some brand new music. We spoke via phone from his studio in Nashville. Let's talk about the Elvis project that you're doing. Give me some background on this. How did it all come about?
Sure. Okay. Originally, Elvis back in the from 66 on, or even earlier than that probably, but I think the earliest tape we had was 60. It may have been earlier than 66, but we had maybe, there was several from 66, that he had recorded way back in the day, and what we were working with was stuff that was from, I think, basically 66 to 72, and he loved gospel music more than anything, and he started every session, and with it generally get the Jordanaires to rally around and play some and kind of warm up a little bit, and I come to find out that some of the people that were with him in Las Vegas said the same thing. After the show, they'd go back to the room and they'd sing gospel songs many nights till dawn, till sun came up. And so he really loved that. And so he'd put out several albums. and they did very well. They were, very successful, but they were all done like 50 years ago. And so I think Sony and there was two factions that had to agree on this project. One is Sony in New York, because they control Elvis's music. The other was a fellow named Joel Weinshanker, and he controls Elvis's likeness. And he's the one that is running the show in Memphis, and he built the hotel down there, and he got the planes back, and a nice venue, and he's in charge of that portion of Elvis's stuff. And so he had gotten in touch with a fellow named Andy Childs. Now, Andy was a country artist from Memphis, actually, originally, a country artist that had the 2 or 3 records out in the 90s, and didn't really become a giant. Knows a lot of people, but didn't really become a giant household name. But in town, knows a lot of folks, and so he'd moved on to doing some other things. Like he's got he still sings some jingles, but he also has and he does he has a what do you call it, a corporate band that he and some other refugees from failed record deals have put together, and they kill it. They're a band called Six Wire, and they're phenomenal. And they open up these corporate things and play these events and charities and all, and they'll get one of the ex-lead singers from Journey, or an ex-lead singer from Kansas, because Kansas changed singers for a while, and Syrian, he'll get Chris Isaac to sing a couple of songs. So he'll put these packages together where the band can play anything. They're all session quality players, and there may be a couple of country songs, a couple of rock songs, a pop, and they're doing that. But in addition to this, Andy also has been instrumental in working with Elvis's through Joel, Elvis's some of the Elvis Week and some of the different events that they do and that kind of stuff, and some of the big screen stuff, where they would show a big screen with Elvis, but have a live band playing. And so he's kind of been one of Joel's go-to guys. And so Andy calls up and said, "Hey, I've got a really cool project." And so we started talking about it. And what it was this, that while the gospel records were great back in, 50 years ago, for what they were, these days, nobody would make a gospel record like that. I mean, they just wouldn't, they wouldn't sound quite the same. The structure of a lot of those Elvis things was from the downbeat. Everybody was in, just huge, just, and there was, and so they got in touch with Andy, and they said, "Look, let's figure out how to do this." And so they figured the songs, went through a lot of songs, figured the songs, whittled it down, because he did several albums. There's lots of songs of the gospel stuff. And so they whittled it down. And so then they released, Sony and Joel had to co-agree, and they all did. And so Sony, New York, Sony Legacy got, which is Willie Nelson and Elvis Presley and, big iconic artists. And so they released the tracks, the lead vocals on some of these original records that we wound up working with. And really, really incredible stuff. Songs like "I've Got Confidence," "Crying in the Chapel," "How Great Thou Art," which was huge, and "You'll Never Walk Alone," and "He Touched Me," "In the Garden," and just "Amazing Grace," and all these things. And then what we would have to do is we went into this saying, okay, look, we're not going to turn Elvis into we're not going to turn him into Justin Bieber. Nothing wrong with Justin Bieber, but that would not be respectful of who Elvis is and his legacy. And so more like what we approached was like, if we were all in the studio about to record and Elvis walks in the door just out of the blue and says, "Hey guys, let's make a gospel record." And that was the approach. It's like, we wouldn't do it quite the same way. The arrangements are a little different. Andy rearranged this stuff. A lot of times these songs were like 2 minutes and 10 seconds long, the originals. And that just seems, well, it's very short. And so what he would do was restructure it. And instead of like having verse, chorus, verse out, or verse, chorus out, he may put an instrumental in, or this kind of situation, and to try to give it a more modern approach. Now, we had the lead vocal, and that's all we worked with. We had the other stuff, but we didn't use that. I mean, because that was the whole point. And so we put the lead vocal, and we figured out what we wanted to do with that. And then the task was, he'd come up with arrangements. In some cases, we moved the band, the grid to Elvis. In others, we put Elvis to the grid, because you can't add a new band if everybody's just wandering around. It just doesn't work. So we had to actually put him on the grid and find the tempo that is a good average. And so on some, we moved Elvis to the grid, and quite a few of them actually. And on some we didn't at all. We just had the band go with Elvis. And what we wound up finding is, like, almost all of them, the early stuff back in the 60s, almost everything we worked on was cut at RCA Studio B.
Oh,
and cool. They one of these was, I think, 2-track, but I think the rest were 3 tracks, maybe a 4-track. Then there was maybe an 8-track. I'm not sure. Maybe 116. I can't remember. But Elvis in RCA Studio B is just one room, no ISO. So he was always on a handheld mic because he liked to work handheld mic in the room. Sometimes there were ribbon mics. Ribbons are hot on both sides. So we were hearing on his vocal track, we're hearing drums, we're hearing piano, we're hearing backgrounds, we're hearing upright bass and his vocal.
Wow.
So it was tricky. It was really tricky. And, and on top of that, they printed, like, they had a live chamber at Studio B, and they printed like this 3-second long live chamber on his vocals. Oh. So we had leak, and we had this giant cave of vocal. And on the original records, with all those other people crammed in together going at once, it doesn't sound quite as odd. But when you just have Elvis soloed, it's like, well, Elvis is in Carlsbad Cavern. And so we had to address that. And we used the obvious choice is Isotope, RX6 Advanced, and used Deverb and denoise, and it was, that helped a lot, but it wasn't the total answer, because there's just those programs are really designed for like film post-production, where you're hearing some noise in a live little room, a splashy bathroom sounding thing, and you're getting rid of a short, not 3 seconds of verb, that's right. Not. So it was tough. And so I did some of the cleanup, but actually there was a fellow in town, that this great friend of mine, that named Tony Castle. And Tony is really, really good at RX6 Advanced, and it showed me some things, of course. But he's so good, he became our chief cleanup man, and he spent so much time on that program that, and it's slow going, because the problem is, you can get rid of stuff, but then it starts to eat into Elvis Presley.
Yeah, right.
And
right.
that, if you damage the voice to the point it's unusable, then that's no good. Yeah. And so we would take it as far as we could without damaging the voice. And so RX6 Advanced with with even dialogue isolate we would use, and we had denoise, deverb, and we came up early on. We came up with a plan. So Tony sometimes I would clean up some of the noises, the clicks and the pops and some of those things, and then I would give him the vocal, and he would try to get rid of the upright bass and the drums and all that background stuff and the verb, and so we would have a system called like 1X and 2X. 1X was the lightest, the version that cleaned up a lot. Now let's try a 2X that's a little more labor intensive and dig in even harder, and maybe in spots we can use 2X. Right at the end of a line where there's a bunch of stuff going on, maybe we can slip in 2X on the end, have 1X all the way to the end, and then put a little 2X in there that's a little quieter, where you can get away with it. And so anyway, we went down that path, and then we were still, it was good, but it was a tricky thing because at this point we hadn't tracked the players yet. We booked Ocean Way in Nashville, and we had a big, a band of, guitar, bass, drums, keys, electric guitar, acoustic guitar, and great band, and everything was tempo mapped and charted, and a lot of times counts had to be, put on tape so that people would know what's coming up, and also tell them, hey, go with the click, listen to the click, trust it.
Yeah.
It felt kind of like it was unnatural, but it was right. And so it all came out real well. But then it's kind of the chicken or the egg thing. It's like we clean it up as much as we can without damaging Elvis, but then we listen to the band, and then the band would cover some of the stuff, and that was good. But then if the band didn't cover, then we may have to go back and work a little harder, or Andy would alter the arrangement. But when we were tracking, we had Andy and Joel in the, and we would go through and listen to the, agree on the song. They'd already agreed on the songs, and we'd track them. And he knew where the trouble spots were because we'd already put it on the grid, and we already kind of knew. So I, created sessions. We went into the studio and started recording. And then we found out, there's got to be something else that we can try to get rid of some of this voice noise. And we became aware of synaptic unveil.
Oh yeah.
And Synaptic, I guess it is, ZYNAPI, APTIQ, unveil. And it's an interesting program. It's just a different algorithm. They do it a little different way. And that helped a lot. And so between the two, that got most of the trash. But then as we had the band tracked, and then we really started to know, okay, well, what do we have now that's too revealed, that sounds like a blast of weirdness, where there's trash. And so then Andy would have to figure, okay, well, we need this choir. I mean, what he didn't want, one of the things we tried to avoid was the stereotypical of the day, almost call and response. Like Elvis would go, there will be peace, and the background would go, there will be peace in the valley, in the valley. Nobody would do it like that. They don't do it like that anymore.
Yeah, right.
And so, but we had that leak in there, and it's like, well, if we get rid of that, we got to make sure we can get rid of the leak. And where we couldn't get rid of the leak, then we'd add some other backgrounds or some other instruments or a B3 that's active enough to, or a guitar that had some stuff. So we went with we made a modern recording with his vocal, but being totally respecting what he had done and his legacy. So we cleaned it up as best we could. And then as we got into this, just coincidentally, a friend of mine from Atlanta, his name's Lacey Thompson, and Lacey and I have been friends forever. In fact, if you had ever seen in a magazine a picture of a guy holding a microphone and it said "A Singer's Dream," and it was the Thompson Vocal Eliminator.
Yeah.
And the Eliminator he was early on into that and had figured out it was a hardware piece, and it had done real well for him. And so he's moved on and doing other things and doing digital versions of that kind of stuff. And he's telling me what he's doing, and I'm saying, well, let me tell you what I'm doing. I'm working with Elvis Presley here, and we're trying to clean up this vocal, and we got all this reverb that's real long. And what we did not want to do, Andy was very adamant about this. He did not want to go to black between, like, Elvis is singing, now he's not singing, go to black, and then he's back in, because you hear that, you know, it sounds fake. And so we, in some cases, we actually added some noise back in, some room tone, so that when we lowered it, at least it didn't sound like it just went totally black. And so that made it sound more natural, and that worked for us. But then I was explaining this to Lacey, and of Vocal Eliminators fame, and he said, I've got something I think that'll probably help a lot. He said, I hadn't even patented it yet. And he said, but I'll send you a copy. And we worked with it. He said, it's VST, which means I had to put a wrapper on and use the VST, and to try to get rid of some of that verb, because, and it was pretty amazing what that would do. We did that on top of kind of the third layer after 1X and 2X, with the RX and then Unveil. And then we'd add that where we needed to. And there's some areas where it just dried it up like pretty amazingly.
Wow.
And other areas, in some spots we couldn't do it. It damaged Elvis, and we weren't going to mess with E. We can't.
Yeah, right.
We can't just win the battle but lose the war, because we turned him into something bad. So we did the best we could. And so that was the three things, and he wouldn't exactly tell me what it was, because he hadn't even patented it yet. And I think he's gonna. It'll be later on when he releases that. But anyway, I had a, kind of a prototype of that, and that helped a lot. Lacey's a really bright guy. I mean, very, very normal, but very bright. And so we worked with his, and so that's what we did. And when we started to mix, then it really became obvious, okay, we've cleaned it up well enough. And gosh, but on the first line of "You Saw Me Crying let's use Lacey's version, that really dries it up, so that you hear it dry at the front, and then you just kind of assume that it's going to be dry the rest of the way, which it's not, but it kind of fools the ear that way.
Sure. Yeah,
and it was fascinating. And there were also there were three producers on this. There was Joel Weinshanker, Andy Childs, who's a great musician, plays guitar and keys, and great singer. And actually, he's steeped in the gospel tradition. He was married to one of the Blackwood sisters, Blackwood daughters, from way back, and not anymore. But so he knew all these, and we even brought in some original. They're old now, but some of the original Imperials and the Stamps, and some of the people from that had sang on the records originally, and also out live in Vegas, and
wow.
And on the road. So it was we went to Tracking Room for that. We lined up like 7 or 8 of these guys, Terry Blackwood and Donnie Sumner and Larry Strickland was a bass singer, and we put them all lined up and baffled them and put mics on them and recorded, got several takes. And so that was pretty fascinating, kind of a reunion for some of those guys,
Yeah.
Now they're getting pretty old. And so that was fun. And we did that on a couple of songs. And then Andy also put a smaller group, a modern gospel group that's just phenomenal. And they came out and added what the other stuff. And then there was a giant choir. I mean, a huge church choir that was quadrupled. So it's like For How Great Thou Art and some of these things. It was just massive. And but most of it, we wanted to try to show people really how great Elvis's voice was. I mean, it was astounding how good he sang. And his delivery, his pitch, his inflections, and he's one of these singers because we actually this is what's actually cool. We were privy to some of the outtakes or some of the not outtakes but alternate takes, I guess you would say.
Yeah.
Because they would, as you know, they couldn't comp. They really didn't comp because it was all going at once. They didn't punch. No Pro Tools, no. So basically, you'd run it once and say, "Oh no, that wasn't good." You'd run it again. No, let's change that. Run it again. Maybe the third or fourth take was the one, and so the one was the one, and that's really what most of the world has heard of Elvis Presley. But Andy got some of the alternate takes. Some that like were take one, and maybe the thing didn't go all the way before it stopped and they changed something, but where his voice was really fresh and just a slightly different approach, a different lick or something. So it was kind of breathtaking really to hear, Elvis sort of comped, so to speak.
Did you use any of that?
Yes, we did. We did on several of these things. And what Andy did not want to do wisely was say, okay, well, we got this chorus. Well, let's copy and paste and then copy and paste again so that we have now a 3.5 minute song and not a 2 minute song.
Yeah.
He said, I'm not doing that. I don't want to. So he would find an alternate take with a different Elvis vocal, same song, same band, but just different. And, so that it doesn't sound like it's all pasted together,
Yeah.
which was very cool to do. And so that was the routine. And in addition to having the old timers, the gospel legendary singers from the 60s, and the small group that Andy put together, and he called on Gus Gacious, who is a great modern gospel singer, and put together a group. And in the big church, also, Andy went to New York. I didn't make this trip. I really wish I could have. I had to keep mixing, but because there was a deadline, and our deadline was Elvis Week, which is August 15th. So it had to be done by then, which means it had to be done like 3 weeks ago, a month ago, to get, because they're doing vinyl, they're doing a cassette, and they're also doing the DVD.
Uh-huh.
And so it's a lot of lead time that was necessary. But so he went up and got Cissy Houston, Whitney's mom, and Darlene Love on this record as well.
Wow.
And because Darlene and Cissy had sung with him in the past, I think Cissy had sung one of them had sung in the Elvis in the Vegas, I think, and the other was singing with him on the 68 comeback special, the one they called the Elvis 1968 comeback special.
Yeah.
And we did one of the songs off of that, which was great. And that was recorded. That track was recorded on the, that was recorded out in Hollywood back in the day in 1968. And so we had that, and there was leak, but it was a different kind of leak. I mean, it was blaring horns and live, and it's really exciting. And there was actually a third producer on this, and it was Lisa Marie Presley. And Lisa sang with her dad on a couple of songs, a song called Where No One Stands Alone, which is the name of the album. And, gosh, what's the other one? It was, I can't remember. She sang on two of them. One of them was Where No One Stands Alone. And it was extremely, extremely, neat to hear her. I mean, cause she was 9 when he died.
Yeah.
And, so they've got a picture of her and him leaning down and talking to her, cause they've got, just like with so many of these big artists, everything is, every picture is taken, every moment is documented. But the exciting thing about this to me was, I mean, I'd seen Elvis live back in the early 70s. He came to the Omni in Atlanta, and I saw him there, and it was breathtaking. It was unreal. But, certainly you never think, well, I'm going to get to work with Elvis Presley. But when you think about it, there's only been four acts that I can think of that ever achieved this kind of fame and notoriety. Frank Sinatra was first, and then he passed the baton to Elvis, and then there were the Beatles, and then Michael Jackson. And that's arguably the four big ones. And there's others, and that's a very subjective thing, but to be able to entertain, to sing, to dance, to act, to in the Beatles' case, write along with Michael Jackson. So they were so big, they transcended any medium. They were just huge, and so that's why we were so careful to not do anything that we wanted to make sure Elvis would approve.
Let me ask you a question, Ed. When you were mixing, what was your approach? Because way back in the day when this was originally made, the vocals were way, way, way out in front. And I'm just curious if you did the same thing, or were you trying to stay true to that, or did you just make it more modern, or the way you heard it, or how did you do that?
We did make it more modern. We couldn't have it out quite that far. It was one of the things we were trying to get away from. That was 50 years ago, and we didn't bury him either, though, because I mean he's the event. He's what people are coming for. So we were proud of how he sang, and people just don't. Everybody knows he was a great singer, but people don't realize how great he was. Some of these 1966, 67, it's just like, oh my gosh. I mean, and so we would pull him. We'd have him front and center, but we'd pull him back a little bit. And in the mixing approach, we would put things to the left and right of him. We didn't cover him up in the middle as much as we could. And so we try to get things out of his way so we didn't have to turn him up so loud. But one thing we needed to do, so he wouldn't just sound like Mono Man with this echo and this leak in the middle, I created a wide bus, I guess. And what I would do is I would take his vocal and I would add some of the modern effects of verb and maybe a short room, but I would also feed his vocal into a separate bus that I used some MS EQ and some verb, so a little delay, very light, so it doesn't sound like delay man or anything, because we didn't want to do that. I mean, of course, he was using delay back in the 50s, tape delay, but and we use that a little bit, but on a few of these things. But a lot of these, when he would sing, with this MS, and it would, EQ it brighter on the sides and EQ it less in the center, darker in the center. So it kind of made him sound like he was in the room rather than pasted on. Mm-hmm. That's what we tried to do. And in most cases, we were successful with that. Some, it didn't really matter. But on some of these, we wanted that. We didn't want him to see, well, we got a cool new track. We pasted Elvis on that. Then that would not be the thing. So we were pretty careful about that and tried to create, okay, he's in the room, but you're not just hearing him straight back, where you're hearing him a little left and right. But everything we had to do, we had to be careful, because with such a legacy artist, you didn't want to screw this one up, Yeah.
How long did it take you to do the whole project?
This was about a 5-month project, actually. Okay. It was about a 5-month project. And the first month and a half, or maybe at least a month and a half, maybe 2, was prepping the vocals, putting them on the grid where we need to, cleaning them up, seeing what we could get away with, Andy constructing the versions, and then that was tracking was like actually 4 days. Huh. And so we took our time, we got it right, we let everybody get comfortable with it, because we had clicks. I had created 2 different kind of clicks. I had a straight quarter note click, but I also had an 1/8 note click, so that they could have their choice. You want clonk, clonk, you want plopper, 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 whatever you want. And then the guys were blown away singing in their headphones, the voice of Elvis Presley. So
I bet.
It was pretty cool. It was breathtaking. But really it took a month and a half for Andy and Joel to agree on the songs, and to weed out the ones that just weren't going to work. And then and then the construction, so we could overdub to this and make a record out of it with modern guys. And several were they live here, but several from Memphis. I remember with the bass player said, "Hey, believe me, growing up in Memphis, Elvis loomed large in my household."
Yeah, I bet.
So it was tremendous, but we didn't try to put him so far out that it sounded dated, but we didn't bury him either, like a pop record. We wanted people to hear what he's doing, but also be able to enjoy the band as well.
Sure. What were the original tapes like? Were they in good shape?
Amazingly, they were in great shape. They had been transferred and archived by Sony in New York. So we didn't see any real tapes. We saw the Pro Tools files that came down, and almost all were 24-bit 96K. And so since that was what Elvis's files were, that was the session resolution that we went with.
Yeah.
Because there wasn't any point in dumbing that down. And but I'll say that the tapes were, once they were transferred, they were phenomenal. There was no hiss. There really was very, very little hiss. So those guys were in the middle of the analog world, and they knew how to do it. I don't know how hot they were cutting, or if they were using low noise tape or what, but it was like there wasn't a lot of, I'd gotten more hiss on stuff that I'd recorded in the mid 70s than they got.
Yeah.
I didn't hear any hiss, really, almost very little hiss, very little. But the problem, like I said, was all the leak, because sometimes you'd solo up an Elvis Presley vocal before we'd cleaned it up, and it sounded like a mix. Well, I hear bass, I hear drums. It sounded like a mono mix. Bass, drums, backgrounds, drums, and all this verb. And so it was shocking. And but Andy wanted to try to clean the vocals up as much as we could, so we could really hear how good he was.
Yeah,
he was tremendous. There's some stuff on here that just gives me, goosebumps.
Yeah.
It's wow. And the thing I noticed from some of these, let's see, what song was it? Oh, it was Crying in the Chapel. One of the interesting things, so we're listening through to the takes and the alternate takes, or actually it was like rolling. They'd roll the tape, and he'd start, and they'd get through it, and then let's do it again. And the second one just very linear, no stacked up like Pro Tools, linear. And so the second one, it was starting to roll down the line, and he said a lyric, and the Jordanaires always would, in a lot of cases, would answer. He'd say, where the da-da-da-da-da, knees and pray. Well, one time on one of these rundowns, they must have lost their place or something, because he sang a line, and then they come in with knees and pray, and he goes, say what? And everybody starts to laugh, and because obviously the knees and pray wasn't the right place to be when they sang it. And so you can hear him laughing, you can hear him joking, but he has that ability that, as some of the great artists that we know have, in that he can be clowning, he can be joking. Okay, here we go, rolling, here we go. Woof. And now he's right back into character.
Yeah.
It was great. It was like, some people can't do that, can't turn it on and off like that.
Yeah.
And get serious about it again.
Sounds like it was a huge amount of fun.
It really was. It was a gas. Like I said, a 5-month process, and about a song a day we'd mix, and maybe get a little ahead on one or two, but it was something else. It was a lot of fun, and it's one of the few projects where it was a lot of intense working at it to get it, but it was tremendous fun, and I'm just so fortunate that I was called to do the job, because this doesn't happen very often,
Yeah. I want to ask you one question, kind of off the subject here. The last time you were on the podcast was 4 years ago, and it was on number 28, and this one's going to be number 221, I think. What's changed in 4 years for you? Have you seen anything in the business change? What's changed for you, the way you work?
The big thing that has changed is the proliferation, I guess you can say, of the track guy. the track guys. In other words, all these great players moved to Nashville because LA is, of course, there's still sessions, but there's a lot of rock bands and TV out there. In New York, a lot of dance. And so all the real players had moved here from all the other areas. And we used to do demos, and we would crank it up, count it off, and we would play down the song, and the artist would, or the singer or the demo or whatever, would record. Now, so many of the artists have one of the co-writers or a track guy that programs the bass, programs the loop, programs the drums, programs the keyboards, and maybe you'll stick a background on there and the lead vocal. That's it. So that has really changed a lot. Whereas there are just less people involved in making these records, a lot of these records. It's more of the pop approach, really. Mm-hmm. And that can be good and bad. I mean, economically it can be good, but it really depends on how well the arranger is that's doing the track guy thing, where the one guy programs virtually everything. And it's just like it was. The same thing happened when you had arrangers, and the arranger would arrange. If you had Quincy Jones arranging your stuff, you know you were in good hands and it was going to be great. But if you had an arranger that had stuff in the way of the vocals and in the way of the band, just like today with the track guys, if the drums and the loops don't work together and you get strange rhythms going that sound odd, then you've got a strange track. And so I think that you just got to really be careful about that. But that's the big difference, I think. That, and there's less studios than before. There's more recording going on at houses. Although I'm seeing that I think it's kind of flirting it going back a little bit to a real band, because the great thing, as you know, is like, as a guitar player, I got an idea, and then you had an idea on keyboard, and then well, yeah, I like that, and I'm going to add on to that, and all of a sudden you get lots of creativity on there, not just one man's creativity.
Yeah.
And that's a big thing. That's pretty important. Gosh, less studios. Vinyl has started to continue to stick its head up, and now cassettes. I mean, I don't really expect vinyl and cassettes to dominate, but it's kind of interesting that it has. There's several places here in town that have lathes again, and there was a time there were like 3 or 4 lathes on some of the main streets here, and then no lathes, and now there's a few lathes that are coming back.
Thanks for listening and being in my inner circle. Remember, if you have any questions or comments, send them to questions@BobbyOInnerCircle.com. To listen to other episodes of Bobby Owsinski's Inner Circle, go to BobbyOwsinski.com and select the podcast tab, or go to BobbyOInnerCircle.com, or find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Mixcloud, Google Play, and Google Podcasts. At BobbyOwsinski.com and BobbyOInnerCircle.com, you'll also find a sign-in form for my newsletter for alerts for new podcasts. This is Bobby Owsinski. I will see you next time.